Take two. I'm going to try this again. Sooner or later I'll get it right. Okay, so I'm greetings to all my Readers Retreat friends. I'm doing a book review today, but it's not a book review of a single book, rather a review of a certain genre of literature in Latin America that I would call nation-building romances or national epics. And it turns out that almost every country in Latin America has one of these books, if not more than one, but usually one in particular that stands out. I was recently redesigning our introductory course in Latin American and Caribbean Studies because it's supposed to be interdisciplinary, but for many years it's tilted towards political science and international relations, so I found a new textbook that each chapter deals with Latin America from a different disciplinary aspect. So one chapter is on literature, another chapter is on history. There's a chapter on popular culture, visual culture, art. There's chapters on international relations, political science, sociology, etc. And when I got to the chapter on literature, I realized that I was woefully weak in my understanding of literature in Latin America. When I did my undergraduate degree at Ohio State University, it was primarily literature-oriented and history. But then once I got into the master's degree, it was more sociology and political science. And, of course, my PhD was in history. So I felt like it was time to refresh my knowledge of Latin American history. So I began reading through a list of books that Philip Swanson recommended in his chapter. His book is Companion to Latin American Studies, Routledge 2014. It's a little bit modernist. If that doesn't bother you, it's a good book. But the chapter on literature is especially good. So I began with the first book was one of the classics of Latin American literature that for some reason I just never gotten around to reading it. I'm still recovering, by the way, from my surgery, getting ready for the coronavirus. Trying to practice social distancing here and using YouTube to get around it. So, I read Domingo F Sarmiento's book, Facundo, Civilization and Barbary, written in 1845. Sarmiento was an educator, Argentine politician. He spent some years in Washington as a ambassador. He was impressed with the U.S. educational system and tried to take it home to Argentina to advocate public education. And in 1845, he was in exile, political exile, and the dictator in Argentina was Juan Manuel de Rosas, a very bloody tyrant who used a secret service or a secret police force to brutalize and terrorize his enemies. Hence, Sarmiento was in exile. And so he wrote Facundo, Civilization of Barbary. Instead of criticizing Rosas directly, he selected one of Rosas' henchmen, Facundo Quiroga, who was another caudillo, charismatic military leader and thug in one of the interior provinces of Argentina. And he basically gave an overview of Facundo's life, but he weaved his story around the themes of civilization and barbarism. And it created an overarching theme, a meta-narrative, if you will, that has perpetuated throughout all of Latin American literature, even up through the boom novels of magic realism and up to 1990s with Mario Vargas Llosa, a Peruvian author, wrote The War at the End of the World, one of my favorite novels based on a true story, a true historical context. And in the 1990s, it's still dealing with this pendulum swing between civilization and barbarism, almost 150 years after Sarmiento. So I read his book. It was good. And I moved on from that to a Cuban novel called Cecilia Valdez, written in 1839 in Havana by Cirilo Villaverde, a Cuban author and politician and public actor. He wrote Cecilia Valdez in the and he set the story in the 1830s. The story is one of tragic romance between Leonardo, who is the son of a wealthy Creole magnate slave owner named Candido, and Leonardo falls in love with a beautiful light-skinned mulatta named Cecilia Valdez. What Leonardo does not know, and what his father Candido did not know, was that Cecilia, he did know, the father did know, but he didn't know who the love interest of his son was. But Cecilia turns out to be the illegitimate daughter of Candido, the slave owner. And she had been born 17 years earlier. Her mother had died in childbirth. Candido had covered it up and kept it hidden as his private sin. Now his son, legitimate son, Leonardo, is pursuing his illegitimate daughter, Cecilia, in a cross-racial romance. That's hard to say. Too many R's. Cross-racial romance. So Leonardo's infatuated with Cecilia. He seduces her. He then drops her, abandons her when he finds out she's pregnant, because he's engaged to marry a wealthy white girl from a wealthy family in Cuba. And Cecilia has another admirer, Josepimiento, who's black. He's a freed black man. That means in other words, he's not a slave, but he is African. And he's a musician, interestingly, because music is one of the ways that Cuba has integrated its subcultures of white and black into a mixed genre of music called salsa and a few others. So Josepimiento gets a pistol and goes and assassinates or kills Leonardo and goes to prison. So the message of the story is a tragic one, that because of Cuba's sins of the white ruling class against the black and mulatto classes, that racial reconciliation is doomed to failure, and it's going to be difficult to create a national identity of Cubanness as opposed to black Afro-Cuban or white Cuban. I think the symbolism is obvious. The next book that I read was Maria, which is a national classic of Colombia, written by Jorge Isaacs in 1864. Some people have considered it the best novel written in the 19th century in Latin America. It's about a young man. It's set in the coffee growing region of Colombia. Efrain is a young white boy or man who falls in love with a darker skinned girl named Maria. But in the course of the story, he has to go away to London to study medicine, and while he's away, she becomes ill. And when he finds out, he travels as hard and as fast as he can to get back across the Atlantic and get back into Colombia to make it to his hometown, which was not easy in the 19th century in Colombia. And he arrives there just within hours after she dies. Again, another sob story, another message that even though there's a beautiful romance, the possibility of racial reconciliation is frustrated in the end and does not work out. And so, how do you build an identity of being Colombian if you're from the various regions of Colombia, if you're white, if you're Afro-Colombian, if you're indigenous, do you think of yourself first as an Afro-Colombian or as a Colombian? This has some pertinence for our current identity politics, perhaps, in the United States. Am I first an American, or am I first a woman, or black, or trans, or gay? This is the kind of thing that they were dealing with in Latin America in the 19th century. They wanted to build national identities, and yet they had at least three racial groups, predominant racial groups, plus a number of cross currents. Mestizos and mulattoes were combinations of the dominant racial groups, and a lot of trauma, social and collective trauma. How do you become a Colombian? How do you unite your population to think of themselves as Colombian in such a circumstance? The final book that I read that was my favorite of all of them was Dona Barbara by Romulo Gallegos. It's a Venezuelan national classic. It was written in 1930, about 100 years after Cecilia Valdez. And if you Google it, you'll find many, many TV soap operas, films, and movies have been spun off of it. I'm sure there's copies out there in English. In fact, I think I read one in English. I read faster in English than I do in Spanish, so sometimes I take a shortcut. Okay, Venezuela. Romulo Gallegos, by the way, was elected president of Venezuela in 1948, even as Domingo Sarmiento became president of Argentina in the 1860s. One final, so the hero Santos Luzardo was taken from his Venezuelan cattle ranch as a boy and moved to Caracas with his mother in order to receive an education after some tragic events with his father and older brother. He grows up in Caracas, becomes a lawyer. He's thinking about going to Europe on an extended trip, and decides in order to do that he would finance it by selling his inherited property in the Los Llanos, which is the plains area of Colombia. It's somewhat like the plains area of the United States. It's this vast area that extends from Venezuela into Colombia, and it's mostly good for cattle ranching, not much else. It's called Los Llanos, or the plains. And so he goes back to his farm in, which I don't recall the name of it right now, but it has some symbolic significance. And I didn't put it in my notes here. But he goes back to his farm to set it in order and to make sure everything's in order for him to sell it. But once he gets there, he starts to reminisce about his childhood as a plainsman, riding horses, roping cattle, and he kind of falls in love with nostalgia for his childhood, and he decides to stay. But there's a problem. In his absence, a woman, a very devious and manipulative woman, very attractive and seductive woman named Dona Barbara, had gotten control of one of the ranches. All through the book there's a sub-theme of her doing witchcraft and using superstition to manipulate her peons on the farm, who basically are a bunch of thugs, murderers, and thieves. And she manipulates the legal system. She commits murder. She seduces men in order to get control of the surrounding farms around her. So by the time he returns, she's quite wealthy and quite powerful. Also along the way, she had had an affair with Santos Luzardo's cousin, which had resulted in the birth of a daughter. She rejected maternal feelings, and the cousin took the daughter and raised her. Maricela was the name of the daughter. The reason why Santa Barbara is such a tragic and diabolical figure is that as a young girl, 16 years old, she was in love with a young Venezuelan man, but a group of river pirates took him off and killed him and then gang raped her. And she hardened her heart and became a hater of men. And so she would seduce men, she would manipulate men, she would use them, but she wouldn't open her heart to love them. And that explains and gives you some sympathy for the way she is. Santo Luzardo and Dona Barbara come into immediate conflict. She represents barbarism. He represents civilization, being a lawyer, educated in Caracas. He's trying to reestablish his boundaries of his farm. He tries initially to do so respectfully, but he's immune to her charms. He's not interested. She, in turn, falls in love with him. It's not entirely clear if it's an infatuation or what kind of love it is. But she sees him as a courageous, manly man, a man of valor, a man of honor, and she's attracted to him. And so this sets up a conflict between Santos Luzardo and his employees, his cowboys, and Santa Barbara and her gang of thugs. The book is very well written and has good characters. It's fast-paced. It reads very much like a classic American cowboy novel. I couldn't put it down. It really engaged my attention. So eventually Santos Luzardo sort of adopts Maricela, his cousin, and also Santa Doña Barbara's daughter. She's in rough shape. Her father is a drunk. He's deteriorating. He hasn't taught her any social graces. So here we get into kind of a story. I can't remember the name of the story, of where a British gentleman takes a woman of the street, a young lady, and teaches her how to be a lady. You probably remember that. I don't remember the name. But this is what Santos Luzardo does. He takes her under his wing. He has his household clean her up. He begins teaching her how to read and write. And they begin to teach her the social graces. Once they clean her up, she's strikingly beautiful. Of course, along the way, he falls in love with her, but he is very respectful and treats her with respect. Dona Barbara finally realized she's losing the battle with Santos Luzardo. She's also losing the love battle to her rejected daughter, Maricela. And so near the end of the novel, she rides out on a horseback, goes to Santo Luzardo's homestead and his ranch, sees him and Maricela talking through the window, pulls out her pistol, and intends to shoot her daughter as her competition. And for the first time in her life, her heart is stabbed with a pang of motherhood. And she feels love for her daughter. And she then whispers, "I hope you are happy," and decides to leave her daughter to be with Santos Luzardo and find the happiness that she never did. And she rides off, and no one ever hears from her again. There's an obvious high degree of symbolism in this. I neglected to mention that Dona Barbara is considered to be a mestiza. She's very beautiful, but she's slightly dark-skinned. She has indigenous blood, and so therefore so does Maricela. So this is an example where the romance is frustrated between civilization and barbarism. Santos Luzardo and Dona Barbara, but its success, this cross-racial reconciliation is successful between Santos and Maricela, and it's considered to be a national epic for Venezuela, this story. So moving on, I've just got a few more minutes here. So what underlying lessons can we detect from 100 years of basically 19th century Latin American literature? Number one, that there's this ongoing struggle between civilization and barbarism that began when, at least in the mind of many Latin Americans, it began when Christopher Columbus stepped off his boat and encountered the Taino Indians in the Bahamas. Number two, because of the tragic trauma that was experienced in the conquest of Latin America and the forcible conversion of indigenous Americans, and then further the forcible slavery and importation of Africans. There's this huge issue of racial reconciliation. Latin America is not racially reconciled, even though in some ways it may seem to be more so than the United States, because there's much more miscegenation, there's much more intermarriage, but there's still this founding trauma of violence between racial groups. In order to create nation states, you have to create public citizenry. In order to have a public citizenry, it can't just be of the white European descendants. It must include mestizos, indigenous peoples, African peoples, mulattoes. How the overwhelming challenge for statesmen in Latin America in the 19th century is how to integrate these diverse populations and how to do so successfully. And they tried to work that out in their literature. And of course, as I noted, Sarmiento and Gallegos both became presidents of their countries. Mario Vargas Llosa ran for president of Peru, and he lost in the election to Alberto Fujimori, famous for fighting the Shining Path and becoming somewhat of a corrupt dictator. So, two things so far: civilization of barbarism, racial reconciliation. The third thing is the need to create a national identity. How do you get an Aztec Indian in Zacapoaxtla, Mexico, to think of themselves as a Mexican rather than as an Aztec or as an Indian? This was in Colombia. This was even true regionally. Paisas were Colombians that lived in Medellin, but they thought of themselves first as Paisas and secondarily as Colombians, because of the mountain systems were such that it was very difficult for there to be communication and travel between the various regions of Colombia. So, civilization of barbarism, racial reconciliation, creating a unified national identity. Okay, here's where this gets interesting, and I'll try to wrap it up quickly here. After I read Dona Barbara, I was so impressed with the novel that I started trying to think, is there any U.S. equivalent, a national epic or a nation-building romance novel that maybe from the cowboy genre that would be that would typify American national identity. So I thought of Mark Twain's novels. They're obviously very much Americana, but they're not exactly cut from the same mold. I thought of the novel The Virginian, which I think was the first cowboy novel ever written around 1901 or 1902. I haven't actually read it. I used to watch the TV series, The Virginian. I thought of a couple of films like High Noon and Shame that are iconic Western movies that were early in the development of that genre. But I couldn't exactly think of any particular novel that fit this paradigm. And so then I started thinking about The Last of the Mohicans, written by James Fenimore Cooper. And I wondered if The Last of the Mohicans could possibly serve in that role as a paradigmatic nation-building novel for the United States. And I had never read the book. I'd only watched the movie. What I didn't realize, there were some significant changes from the book to the movie. So in the movie, Hawkeye falls in love with Cora, who's the darker-skinned and darker-haired older sister, courageous, intelligent, and they end up being together at the end of the film. And Major Duncan Hayward, the British major, falls in love with Alice. But Alice falls in love with Uncas, the young Indian chief, who's the son of Chingachgook. And so in the course of the film, if you've seen it, Uncas is killed trying to rescue Alice. And when she sees that he's dead, and that Magua, the villain of the story, is going to take her forcibly to be his wife, she steps off the cliff and commits suicide, rather than being taken as Magua's wife. So ends the one cross-racial relationship in the movie between the fair-haired, very European Alice and the strong and noble, savage Uncas. However, I did some Googling because I had not read the book, and I discovered, to my surprise, that Cora was actually a mulatta, a very fair-skinned mulatta. Her mother had been a fair-skinned mulatta in the West Indies, and Colonel Munro had married her, and Cora was born from that union. And then that mother had died, and he had married a British woman who was the mother of Alice. And so Cora was the Dona Barbara, or the Maricela, or the Maria, or the Cecilia of the story. And in the book, as I finally got the book and began to read it, I used Audible to save some time. And in the book, Hawkeye never expresses any romantic interest in Cora. It was actually Duncan. It was actually Uncas who fell in love with Cora, the dark-skinned girl. And it was Major Hayward who was in love with Alice, the European girl. Alice was the fragile, white-haired, fair-skinned girl who, in the movie, commits suicide, but in the book it's Cora who commits suicide, and Uncas who dies trying to save her. So do you see what's happening here? There is in The Last of the Mohicans the same dynamic as in the nation-building epics in Latin America. However, it's more in the movie, the film made in the mid-1990s. The book, which was written in 1828, I'm thinking, the book didn't go there. There couldn't be for some reason, in James Fenimore Cooper's mind, there couldn't be a cross-racial romance with Hawkeye, the symbol of American rugged individualism, or even Duncan Hayward, the symbol of British civilization. The romance was between Cora and Uncas, between a Native American noble savage and a mulatta girl from the West Indies. That makes me wonder if, as Cooper was writing that, if it just wasn't possible to write the kind of novels that Latin Americans have been reading for a North American audience, because we have a very different view of racial reconciliation, intermarriage, miscegenation is very different among Anglo peoples than it was among Latin American peoples. So, I found it fascinating that there was all these almost similarities with Last of the Mohicans, and yet it didn't quite go there. And then I also found it fascinating that in the mid-1990s, a film was made where it did go there, and there was this cross-racial romance between Cora and Hawkeye that was successful and apparently survived to the end of the film. Why is any of this important? Well, I wrote an email once to no, I forgot his name. The man that wrote, never mind. I wrote an email to a famous author once, a Christian author. He was a philosophy chair of a department in San Diego, I think, in California. He wrote a number of books that most of you have read, and I'm still not recovered from my illness, and I'm drawing a blank right now. Dallas Willard. I wrote an email to Dallas Willard. His personal email had been shut down on his website because of the volume, but I was sneaky and I looked up his academic email, at the university where he was the chair of the philosophy department in San Diego in California, and emailed that one. And I told him I was starting a PhD in history at FIU in Miami, and he wrote me back, to my surprise. He wrote me back and he said, Joseph, just remember that Jesus has been in the history department a lot longer than you have, and you'll be fine. And it was a very comforting word, and it also leads me to the thought that all history is his story, and so we need to be interested in what we might call secular history, as well as sacred history. And we need to understand what the wounds, the traumas of the nations are. Not that there's much that we can individually do much about it, but certainly it's the intent of the kingdom of God to bring healing to now I'm realizing I can't put this out publicly. Oh well. I'll close with Revelation 22:2. On either side of the river was the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for healing of the nations. So may Latin America find healing and racial reconciliation, and so might we in the United States. It's not an easy task, but as these novels may teach us, real love may show us the way. Thank you.